Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. Microsoft released Windows NT 30 years ago on July 27th, unleashing a system whose default configuration and password storage would haunt networks for decades. It required 12 megs of RAM and 90 megs of free disk space. Today's Alpine Linux requires about 8 megs of RAM and 130 megs of disk space, although containers probably have larger hardening guides than NT ever did. But what did NT really stand for? Number 10, new technology, negligible trust, nothing tangible, or perhaps for the sysadmins who had to deal with NT security, it was always, not today, Satan, not today. Which means this week we chat with Eve Mailer about identities, verifiable credentials, and privacy in cars and other connected devices. In the news segment, Zenbleed and AMDs, a drop in 0 days, security testing with SemGrep, security research with Clang, and more. Pass the hash and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Developers have a need for speed to meet market demands, and application security needs to ensure that data and privacy constraints are met. Unfortunately, that can slow down delivery. So, is it even possible to deliver secure software quickly? Enter Secure Coding, brought to you by GuidePoint Security's Application Security Services. Secure coding is more than a process, it's a cultural shift, one that will make it possible for both developers and AppSec to build in security while applications are being developed. Visit our AppSec Resource Hub to learn more at securityweekly.com/guidepoint. This is episode 249, recorded July 31st, 2023. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Mike Shima, what's a nice guy like you doing in a place like this?
Exactly, getting ready to drive my car. But first, one announcement. InfoSec World 2023 is heading back to Orlando, Florida. Join the InfoSec community at Disney's Coronado Springs Resort, September 23rd through 28th. Experience world-class learning and networking through enlightening keynotes, informative panel discussions, interactive breakout sessions, hand-on workshops and summits, and more. As a Security Weekly community member, you're eligible to receive 20% off your InfoSec World 2023 tickets using code ISW23-SecWeek20. Just register at the securityweekly.com/InfoSecWorld2023 to get that code. It's a bit long. Eve Mailer is a globally recognized strategist, innovator, and communicator on digital identity, security, privacy, and consent, with a passion for fostering successful ecosystems and individual empowerment. She has 20 years of experience leading standards such as SAML and user-managed access and publishing research in the field, and has also served as a Forrester Research Security and Risk Analyst. Excuse me there. Eve, hello. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Mike.
We're glad to have you here. And you and I last talked at RSA, so this is a nice catch-up as well.
Yeah, I'm looking forward.
And we at RSA did talk about identity and cars. We only had 10 or 15 minutes to do this, so we've got a little bit more time. And so one of the ways I just wanted to start this off, why do we have identities in cars in the first place? What?
Oh my goodness. I mean, there's identities of everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how many sensors are there in a car? And every one of those is unique and is tracked and generates data and may ingest data. And identity can really help the picture. That's why we want identity of everything.
We do. And so then we have identities of drivers, passengers, lots of people. I'm going to assume you're the expert here to help us out. But I guess maybe set us up. What is that identity starting to look like? Is this, we've got wallets, verifiable credentials. I'm going to throw a lot of terms out there that maybe we should talk about or define a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, mostly when people hear the word identity, they think about identity of people. But the fact is that actually a lot of thing identities are sort of being flung around at the same time as identity of people. And they can help the security picture. They can actually help the experience picture. Just your relationship to your mobile device relies on knowing that unique mobile device. That's an identity, plain and simple. So there's lots of ways that that's valuable. And honestly, there's many more things than people. when you add them all up at the end of the day. So it's an interesting proposition to imagine real identity and access management of things along with the people who use them.
So I guess we'll have to touch on, especially when we start talking about the developer side of things here, the identity for people, identity for the cars and devices, like you said. It sounds like, and here, John, you can turn down the volume so you can hear us a little bit, but is identity the new perimeter? Zero trust. But Eve, you've been in the industry for quite a while. Maybe this is not a very new phrase, in fact. It's not the new perimeter.
Yeah. We've been saying identity is the new perimeter since I checked once, 2006, which was fairly early in my career doing identity. SAML was already on the scene. It was starting to be established. And I think there's a right idea at the core of that. Honestly, it is something really valuable in terms of if we don't have perimeters anymore, extended enterprise, beyond corp, all the rest of it. That's certainly the case. Everything is very permeable. So what I see identity as is kind of that golden thread across all of those different contexts. It's the one thing that you want to share across different levels, across applications, in order to have the right context to make the decisions about access that you need and to give and make the decisions about experience that you need to give people.
Yeah, and those decisions about access and those like sharing your identity, hopefully we've gotten beyond just passwords for proving this. Is that what your experience looks like, to bring us into 2023 rather than 2006?
Yeah, passwordless has been, the word has sort of like taken off like a shot in the last year or so, which is, I'm grateful about because people hate passwords and they're, both insecure and a horrible experience. So passwordless is actually a thing now. It's doable now. Everybody knows about factors. Even all the non-technical people that I speak to in my life these days, when I say 2FA, they're like, "Oh yeah, my bank offers that," and I turned it on. I'm like, "Oh my gosh, we've come to a new era," and indeed we have come to a new era because if passwords are the thing that you need to know, and that's not working for us, then the thing that you are and the thing that you have, biometrics, device, those things are being used really in practical terms to start to eliminate the password from our experience.
That reminds me, there's a brand of car out there I won't mention by name, but they actually have a few buttons on it that you can actually have a passcode, I guess, to unlock the car. And I always wondered about that. But yeah, I'm not sure if there's a minimum or maximum number of digits, but it's like 0 through 9, so it doesn't seem like the best idea. But Eve, our listeners are either going to hate me or love me for asking this, but we're talking about identity in cars and things like that. How does identity in a vehicle fit into zero trust?
Boy, well, a vehicle and identity in vehicles could sure use zero trust. I mean, if zero trust is assume breach, to make it the tiniest phrase that you can equate it to, I have lots of favorite ways to define it. Well, we've seen so many breaches. I mean, breaches are not just for, consumer identity databases, right? They're for cars. And we've seen so many of these instances of really egregious, access being managed wrongly. There was the electric car manufacturer who had the little oopsie where some guy could get into some other guy's car. That is absolutely an identity story. It's absolutely a question of validating access. And at the end of the day, can something be breached? How vulnerable is it? So we need more hygiene. I think we need a bigger picture about how to solve this. And that's why I'm kind of like harping on the identity thing, because it's the one thing that you can sort of transmit usefully between really disparate systems. And, if we're talking connected cars, they use weird, machine protocols. They use a lot of different systems and a lot of different hardware. And so you need to have something translatable to even those contexts.
And I'm being slightly tongue-in-cheek when I ask that, but you give a great answer. But I think also what's interesting about it is these items of identity are not cheap, right? These are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollar vehicles. So that whole trust thing is it's easy for us to sort of throw around zero trust when we're talking about a VPN or something sort of basic like that, the basic usage of it. But I think the same concepts still sort of apply. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, trust and safety take on whole new meanings when you're talking about, a large device that can slam into things and kill them or damage them, and act in unexpected ways when they were used to their being operated by people and having somewhat predictable outcomes. Things like drunk driving aside, I suppose. Yikes. But so there's this whole question of, if you're talking about digital services, it's one level of, sort of fraughtness. How difficult is it to achieve trust and safety? When it comes to hardware, you now have to think about kind of like the physical digital tensions. We're used to, I think, Mike, I said this to you at RSA, we're used to default deny as our kind of authorization strategy. Right. But oftentimes when it comes to hardware that could lock you in and drown you, and boy, this is going in a really dark direction here, but sometimes you need to fail open. You need to think about how to do that in a subtle fashion, in a more fine-grained fashion. And honestly, that's another way to define zero trust, is getting more fine-grained and dynamic about those access decisions, about the confidence that you have in who's in front of you, what's in front of you. So I think that, those lessons still absolutely apply. They gain a new level of urgency when we're talking about these very important devices.
Yeah, and I like that example you're bringing up too, because John and I covered a couple weeks ago an article about car theft that was being done through opening up headlights, getting access to a CAN bus, and there was essentially no strong authentication between essentially the headlight connection and the signal to say, I am the driver. Here's trigger the ignition. Yeah,
that's a great example actually, because like the first line of defense is honestly, figuring out who you have in front of you, and any more multi-factor strong authentication. You can even do strong authentication of devices, and most often what we have is kind of weak authentication. Things like default passwords and passcodes and pins, and some of these things are starting to be legislated out of the IoT picture, if at all possible, through mandating no default password, things like that. So honestly, those are species of identity theft in a way, and those need to be fixed first and foremost. It's not the whole story. It's a really big first step.
It is. And now my brain wants to go in two different ways, like talk about like the strengthening like the WebAuthn, passkeys, et cetera. But let's pause that for a moment, because I still like that idea of like the trust and safety, the fail open, that is more important in this domain, as well as, with identities. There's identities, driver, passenger, identity of the car as well, brings the question, so what else is the car connected to? And I could think of just, how does this affect insurance or other things of just, what are the implications of having that strong tie to say, John has a Ferrari that he drives around Hawaii and, runs stoplights and whatnot while he solves crime.
What is your life, John? Wow.
I might have been Thomas Magnum, but I get the two confused every once in a while.
I grew up in Hawaii, and every time I see one of those old episodes, I'm like, that place doesn't connect to that place. That aside. So this is really interesting because, honestly, I talked about like person to device, even to your mobile device, your phone. There's a relationship between identities. And the two directions you sounded like you wanted to go into, they're really two halves of a whole. One half is the signals you're using to understand what you have in front of you. So authentication is kind of the short form of all of that. But then that doesn't, just identifying something doesn't mean it should get access. So then the second half of that is the decision making. And the shorthand for that is authorization. They're both really needed. So when you think about these crazy ecosystems, I was kind of looking up, what do people think that, V to X means these days? So V to X stands for vehicle to everything, right? And I saw mention of infrastructure, network or cloud, vehicle to vehicle. You're, driving next to some car on the road. You might want to sort of proximity-wise have a communication. Grid, managing, charging and other things. Vehicle to load. So thinking about, fleet, autonomous trucks and what's being loaded into them, having a communication. Vehicle to building or home. Vehicle to, now, for the first time, a person comes into the picture. Pedestrian, which sounds like a really good idea. And I saw vehicle to device, and it immediately made me wonder, where's driver? Where's vehicle to driver? Because I've experienced this. I have a connected car, and I'd like it to be more connected. I'd like it to understand more about the relationships between identities of things and people than it does, right? Because there's multiple different systems in the car, and they all have a different understanding of who I am. And I had to actually log into them differently. And the login used passwords, and I would really like to get to the day when that's not necessary because of things like WebAuthn passkeys, which are becoming quite popular. Really good solution. So for starters, this ecosystem of just communications protocols has a lot going on for, you can imagine all the different purposes, energy management and parking management and, vehicle traffic management, all the rest of those great use cases. But like from the perspective of, okay, well, what data, what does the data ecosystem look like? Some examples that we were giving from stage at RSA, sources of data just from a car. There's the CAN bus, which you mentioned. Headlights didn't come up, but it's obviously a vector. There's telematic systems. There's event data being generated from various things happening to the car, to the driver. There's black boxes that are these official devices that we reference at a crash. There's fleet monitoring systems. So all those can be different sources of data. There's I mentioned sensors, thousands and thousands of them. From the pressure of you sitting on the seat to the tire pressure to the oil levels, all those other things. Where are they going? They're going to the automotive OEM. They're going to dealers. There's a huge first-party ecosystem, and then there's a huge third-party ecosystem. And insurance is absolutely one of those where data is really kind of being monetized, right? Where the data is personal data, and it's affecting that driver pretty directly in terms of their life path.
Oh, absolutely, and this is a huge picture for what developers have to keep in mind now, because you touched on everything from connected, complex, graph relationships between fleets, between objects, we'll just call them devices, to just the APIs with, to the firmware, to whatever is, if there are secure enclaves or I mentioned Windows NT or the Windows SAM database, it's poorly protecting our passwords, or, these are, I think you've said before, cars are rolling APIs. How comfortable? You said you want more connection. How comfortable are you with this API on wheels? What should what should developers be doing to make you feel more comfortable?
Yeah, it was a simpler time. NT was a simpler time, right? We had many more assumptions, and in fact, it was a time of M to M. When it was machine to machine, and we were happy with our crunchy outer shells. And just, letting anything happen inside. And maybe it wasn't okay then, but the consequences are absolutely higher now. And so, what should developers do? Keeping in mind that the passage of all this data and the API calls they're kind of the lifeblood of an application. API security has to take a much bigger role. And identity is actually suffused throughout the API security solutions that you find now. The really good API security approach would be not to use API keys, which are, they're just as bad as static shared secrets passwords that people use. We can do better now, and we have frameworks for that, things like, using OAuth and OpenID Connect, which is based on it. And OpenID Connect injects deliberately that identity piece, which you could have kind of guessed at with the OAuth layer. So a lot of best practices around that. And there's even solutions in the OAuth ecosystem around device handling and kind of, smart thing handling when you don't have a normal interface into which to put a hated password.
So you just walked into something that we've been talking about a few times here, about the smart. The whole thing is obviously a smart thing, and I love that phrase, API on wheels. If we look at, UK governments, I think actually EU as well, and now more recently the US government, they're working on this concept of, I refer to them as nutrition labels, but some sort of a security label on the outside of a product to say, hey, this is sort of, have you put thought into this around cars? Like, is this something we would think about expecting to find in a dealer, or does it matter at all for a vehicle like that?
I mean, I think it does. I mean, my car was made in Germany. I think I was telling Michael about this, and so it feels very compelled to be subject to GDPR, which I'm very happy about. And there is a trend towards kind of standardizing how terms and conditions and privacy policies and data about the metadata about the car ecosystem that's presented to consumers, how that's delivered to people. And there are starting to be more legislative solutions kind of mandating that. I think that's all to the good. It's absolutely an essential component to help people choose certain decisions about what information to share and how to let it be shared if they have that option. Boiling things down to the what does it mean for me? What's in it for me? What's it going to take out of me? I guess is the equivalent when it comes to personal data. I think that nutrition label type approaches, and I think of them as that as well. I always appreciate them when I see them. I mean, light bulbs have nutrition labels showing,
Yes.
The color temperature, which I very much appreciate, and the strength of lumen equivalence. Now that we're in the LCD world or LED world, so anytime you can kind of standardize the stuff that's standardizable and then fill in the parameters for people, gosh, it works. It works for applications. It works for people too. That's how we make all those things kind of down to a no-code level for people. So I appreciate those. Absolutely. I think it's a good thing to do. And actually, I can foresee that happening with the passwordless conversation, like conveying to people, what kinds of authentication are allowed, whether you can configure multiple ones. Are they sensitive to what channel you're on, the car versus the mobile device versus your TV versus other things? So, actually, maybe there's a germ of an idea here.
Yeah, part of that too. Some of that also leads to a lot of the what John was referring to also have provisions around updating or end of life for the product. So as we talk about let's say passwords or password equivalent, how do you see just with these rolling APIs, rotating a password, rotating identity, or even just having updates? Does this become easier, more difficult, scary, especially from a safety perspective?
Well, I mean, it's interesting about the whole notion of rotating a password. That is not a milieu where you really want to be having to change your password. I mean, really. But interestingly, there are standards in this area. NIST special publication 800-63 is all about, it used to be all about e-authentication, and now it's about digital identity. And they're going through this Rev 4 revision now. And they have been contemplating just removing password rotation requirements, every 90 days or whatever, entirely. And I think they've becoming much more savvy over the years about, what value you're getting security-wise out of mandating that. And I think if they do that, it'll actually hasten the world of passwordless, which is just managed in completely other ways. You're talking about, the way that WebAuthn works, kind of the magic in WebAuthn is you've got a client-minted public-private key pair, and it's done per service. So it has that nice, I'm going to say, sort of pseudo identity management aspect of keeping the person kind of like their personal data is sort of locked to that service, and they present as a different authenticator to the next service and the next service. So it limits the blast radius. It's a nice, really nice feature. So yeah, I'd love to see that standardized as well. Like if you're going to ask me to change it, let me know ahead of time. Like, I don't know, a family member was just super annoyed out loud last night about, well, I can't believe, LinkedIn made me change my password and gave me a new password. Like, what? No, it made me assign a new one just when I wanted to do something valuable to me. So it'd be nice to know that ahead of time.
Yeah, and I think, as a comment too, I love WebAuthn because it's also that phishing resistant, as you said. It has those crypto anchors to the who it's talking to, what the client is coming from. So with these, then kind of coming back a little bit from that developer aspect, I think the iOS ecosystem. I think Android is introducing lots of better, easier SDKs for adopting WebAuthn, the 502 standards. are a lot of these aspects getting easier for developers, or is there still like a lot of, and I'm trying to come up with a good car related metaphor here, but is there a wide open track for firmware security? Is there a lack here? I guess, what are the opportunities, or what are the things to be developers really need to be careful of?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm gonna bring in that magical word wallets here, because I can think of exactly how to connect it to the car story, because I got Apple CarPlay, and we do have to be careful of that connection. I think there's a lot of power in sedimenting certain solutions that are no longer sort of a competitive advantage into that layer that Apple and Android are providing. One of the things they're trying to provide is wallet functionality. So I'll just use that as an example to kind of, answer your question. We do have to be concerned a little bit with a security, I guess it's not a monopoly, but a duopoly. When it comes to these certain elements that, you got these two platforms, they're everywhere, definitely ubiquitous in things like, these MMIs. And we have to just beware that that just doesn't lock us in, particularly if they're using standards underneath. That is really a monopoly. And we have to be concerned that there's not a vibrant ecosystem testing that looks okay. That has come up in the world of wallets, because, there's an Apple wallet and there's a Google wallet. And when it comes to the identity angle on that whole notion of a wallet app, there's some concern that, we're sort of hastening to this. There's just going to be these couple of solutions and we won't have the visibility that we'd ideally like. And there is actually an organization that started up. We at ForgeRock helped them sort of launch a little bit, and it's called Open Wallet Foundation, which I think is actually funny because, how many times you want to open your wallet, but it's actually a really important organization, because they're an open source organization as part of the Linux Foundation, collecting a kind of open source infrastructure for how to do things right that provides that third alternative, that way to influence the industry conversation. So I think that's a really important element of, how we're going to solve big security problems. As wallets get more important, whether they're in the car, and that's an interesting use case, or just, on a mobile device or wherever, suddenly all of the attention is going to go on the wallet, and, wallet security becomes really, really important to get right.
Absolutely. And we'll have to, I wasn't aware of that Open Wallet project. We'll have to throw that into our show notes as well, so listeners can go check it out. One of the aspects, I had mentioned, I was trying to work on some great puns, rotating your passwords along with your wheels. But as you point out,
absolutely.
SP863 says we don't have to do that anymore, which I think is wonderful. It's great guidance, but there is then, you have a wallet compromise, or your loss of wallet and someone potentially impersonating you. What is, have you seen like the identity recovery angle on this being addressed, or certain areas that are maybe cars make different, or cars just make curious for this scenario?
Yeah. By the way, you made John's face hurt, so you'll have to just make it up to him later.
Achievement unlocked.
If I liked rotating passwords, I'd love that pun. I think that there is an element of better recoverability, thinking about this new identity wallet conversation. So payment wallets, they're here now.
Yeah.
Crypto wallets, they're here now, but yikes. Identity wallets are starting to be here now. And if we look, Apple and Google are both players at this table. They are, working on these kind of mobile driver's license aspect. Right, and that's a standard MDL. It's an ISO standard. Don't ask me which one. It starts with 18 and then it has 3 digits. But so like thinking about things you absolutely know with high quality, high confidence, high assurance, as we call it in the identity world, about a person. If you know with high assurance that somebody was born on this date, has a driver's license, so they're, certified to operate vehicles of certain types in this state, that's really interesting information for a car to know, to ingest, to become a consumer of. And car data that is, being generated around a driver is really interesting data for somebody else to know, because that biometric data is absolutely, it's a category of behavioral biometrics that could, it's probably as unique as your signature. And that's something that, there are some companies doing biometric authentication that will rely on that kind of information. So, how fast I take a corner, it's much remarked upon by certain, passengers of my acquaintance. So, that could become part of biometric high assurance authentication in a continuous fashion, by the way. So there's some interesting things that could be done there kind of in, bidirectionally.
So that is interesting. Gotcha.
So real quick, what are the thoughts around this? I think you sort of hit upon it when you mentioned the driver's license thing is sort of, it's happening, but it's happening very slowly, right? I think it's like maybe 8 or 10 states right now in the U.S. have the ability to do digital.
It involves states, so it tends to be deliberate.
And cars involve states and federal governments, so we're still, right, multiple federal governments. And where I'm going with this is like, what we're talking about is really cool, cutting edge. Like I think probably, you probably know, I don't think there's a car made out there in 2023 that doesn't have some type of an API usage in it, probably. But at the same time, the thing is, we're mixing technology with a space where things usually don't move very quickly. So how does that affect some of these things we're talking about? I know some of the cars out there now can do like over-the-air updates, but at the same time, I think one of the things we've always talked about is if you make a mistake in that vehicle, once it rolls off the production line, that mistake's going to be there for a while. We've seen this with certain vendors now that are getting heavily stolen by teenagers after watching TikTok.
Yes. Yeah. All it takes is one YouTube video and they're golden. Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple things here. One is the recent stat that I found, now I can't remember if it was like from 2021, 91% of cars rolling off the line are connected cars. So there's that. And we know from the general consumer IoT world, maybe the entire IoT world, that, it's consumer experience and innovation first. And kind of security second. And you guys are probably used to that being a theme. The challenge is that it's not good enough. Like, every single one of the automotive OEMs has a new mobility vision, and they're trying to make an experience that is just amazing and impossible with a non-connected car. It's, we're now into the world of, all the virtual reality things that you could do that don't have, actual Earth physics is where I think they're trying to head. And so they have to contend with, well, if you're going to expose these APIs, if you're going to be connected, any car with a browser, any car with a net connection is absolutely hackable. And the standard has to be higher if you want to live up to that vision. And then there's the really long tail of cars that are out there that have older versions that don't have the opportunity for over-the-air updates. I mean, OTA is actually a really good thing for both security updates, being more timely, more fine-grained and dynamic. Also for, there's a lot of software-defined features that can be turned on, which can add to the whole vision. It has to be committed to. And Apple's an example of a company that gets certain things really right when it comes to, rolling out updates fast if there's an oopsie. So I think we're going to have to start treating cars like that too. Like everybody should just turn on automatic updates and then have a lot of transparency, maybe a nutrition label around what has been done and what options there are to turn on features that have been added, things like that. So I'm hopeful that it's a generational thing a little bit in terms of cars, not in terms of people necessarily, but, with each new generation of cars that gets faster and better and tighter. It requires, excellence on the part of the security industry, really.
It does. And now I got to squeeze one more thing in here, Eve. Now that you've sparked everyone's interest on this topic, would you like to plug something coming up that they can find out more about identities or what you've been talking about?
Well, a couple things. We do publish an annual identity breach report, and that is out there. It's the 5th annual, so we have some nice comparisons. Also, you mentioned InfoSec World. I'll be there talking about AI. Had to get that into the conversation. So maybe I'll see you guys there. Maybe I'll see your listeners there, and hope we'll have a good time out there in Coronado Springs.
Absolutely, yeah. So, listeners, please go find Eve there and have some more discussion with her. Have a chat. One other thing, Eve, you mentioned that ISO 18 and 3 digits. I won't ask you what those 3 digits are, but we do like to ask our guests to describe AppSec in 3 words. So, I'm curious what your response to this would be.
It's 18013. So there. All right. Here's my 3 words. Access über alles.
Oh, I have the song stuck in my head now too.
Because
Good
because an application that is out there in the wilderness with no connections, I'm not so worried about its security. It's about identity and identity that feeds access. Those are my 3.
I think that's a wonderful way to wrap things up, and I think that fits quite well with the theme that you were describing for us, from identity to wallets to authentication everywhere. So I want to say thank you for a wonderful chat, Eve.
It's been a great pleasure, you guys.
I want to thank John as well, and thank all of our listeners. We're going to take a quick break now and return with news of the week.